later that year, I got my first. I'd started to get into jazz. Okay, yeah, I guess that's the year. It must have been late in 1973. I was at somebody's house and I heard they had RTI on, which I'd never heard of, and these sounds, and back then I guess they weren't as watered down as they are now. They played this lengthy piece. It turned out it was Coltrane's tune called Brasilia, which is on that album called The John Coltrane Quartet Plays. And I was so intrigued by McCoy's harmonies and the really exotic swirling sounds. Let's see, I had just gotten a day job as a psychiatric aide at Norristown State Hospital. And that lasted about 6 weeks. I trained, they paid me to train for about a month, and then maybe I lasted another month before I just quit because I started getting musical jobs. Okay, anyway, there was a place in Schwenksville, Pennsylvania, which is where the Philly Folk Festival is held. But there was a place at the time, since burned down, called the Red Fox Inn. And somehow I heard, I don't know how I heard, but somebody said they needed a pianist on Sundays. So I went and auditioned. I think I knew 2 tunes, Misty and Moonlight Serenade. And then I played excerpts from a Rachmaninoff concerto. And they said, okay, you're hired. You start at 2 in the afternoon and we go till midnight. How's $25 sound? And I didn't know that that wasn't the norm. I really didn't. And
10 hours.
So after I exhausted the 2 tunes, you know, I knew a handful of Beatle tunes, but then I basically just improvised, like in the idiom of Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky, making up melodies and flowering it up. And then the owner pulled me aside and said, you need, now actually, I have to give the credit, not that many club owners would even be knowledgeable, like to even know the word tune. They said, you got to learn some tunes. Why don't you come in on a Friday or Saturday and hear this guy we have here playing, Gerald Price? And I said, sure. I went in. And that was the other thing that hooked me. You know, I got the yin from the Coltrane stuff, and I got the yang from hearing Gerald's trio with Benny Nelson and Al Jackson. They had known the owner because he had used to run a place in the city where they were customers or something. Or Benny got the gig. And you know, I would just sit there for hours every weekend and absorb these sounds.
And what were they playing standards? And
yeah, for the most part.
Jazz standards?
Yeah, they played all kinds of stuff. One thing they always asked for it, but it was great the way he did it. Gerald did this arrangement of Mr. Bojangles, and he would play on the strings. Like he'd play a phrase of the melody, then comp for himself. It was an upright that was open, so he would play the strings like a guitar. And yeah, I heard the name, but I didn't really know who Oscar Peterson was. But anyway, I would have these long conversations with those guys, and
How old were you when you're
19.
So this is 1973.
3 or 4 at this point, but probably 3, yeah. And then I asked Gerald if he taught. He said, yeah. At the time, he lived right near 46th and Market, so I took the train down, took the subway, went to his house, and it was a whole different kind of teaching than I had ever been exposed to. He'd pull out a tune and start playing, and he'd say, you hear D flat 7 there? And then he explained about substitutions. And he says, of course he had huge hands. I had to adapt some things. But it was sort of, I learned pretty heavily that way. He went through a lot of tunes. He actually knew what he was playing, but a lot of the explanations were simple. And then he would complain about Dakota Staton's husband because he apparently Gerald accompanied Dakota Staton, and she was known to be somewhat difficult to work with, and her husband did her charts. He was a trumpeter, and when Gerald said that one time he gave him a hard time. He says, "You didn't put the sharp 11 in that chord," and Gerald said, "I put it in there. It was just somewhere different." And then, but just these little snippets of stuff. Somehow I absorbed these ideas. Oh, you can play it this way, or you can play it this way, or you can play, So he got me started with that, and then told me about learning tunes, and then he said, for a different dimension also, try to find a bass player. So there was a local bass player, Alan McCouch, who later on studied with Al for years, Al Stauffer. He was new to the upright. He had basically played electric and rock bands too, but he was pretty good.
How long did you study with Gerald?
I actually don't know. There was a period where I was with him and Bernard at the same time, maybe. So I'd say with Gerald, maybe 6 months, 8 months. And then I forget what I was on early.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Before that.
You were talking about how his teaching method, how he...
Oh, yeah. So, shortly after that, I did find this bass player, and we started our own jazz group. We got a drummer. Oh, that brings up a whole new angle of how I flirted with the fringes of jazz for a while before getting into it. The drummer had played a lot of John McLaughlin stuff, Mahavishnu and stuff like that. And then when I got my first paycheck from Norristown State Hospital, I blew it on. I went to Sam Goody's downtown, blew it on a stack of vinyl that was sort of random. There were some names I knew. Of course, I got the Coltrane, one of which was Meditations. I had no idea what I was in for, but I liked it. And I also got Oscar Peterson, Miles, and...
Did you have an electric piano you were playing on these gigs, or was there a piano?
No, almost every place had a piano then.
So you didn't have an electric?
No.
Okay.
Gerald had mentioned listening to Oscar Peterson, so I got some of his stuff, with some of it with Ray Brown, some with Sam Jones, and I just listened to this stuff nonstop. But I would see John McLaughlin's name on a Miles record, so I would get it, and then I get another Miles record that he wasn't on, but it was a whole different bag, like Wayne Shorter and Herbie, or Wynton Kelly and Hank Mobley, various. So to me, it was never abnormal to embrace the entire tradition. I didn't even think about, do I have to pick one way or the other? I liked it all.
Now, did the band you were in with your drummer, like John McLaughlin
and the guitars too.
And the guitars too. Okay. What tunes did you pick for your band? Were there any styles, or just a mixture? Or?
It was a mixture. Believe it or not, we played. I guess this was inspired by Monty Alexander's version. We played the theme from Love Story. My first bebop tune that I learned was a bird tune that we did called An Oscar for Treadwell, which is rhythm changes in C.
Believe it or not, I interviewed Oscar Treadwell.
Really?
Yeah, I have his interview.
Oh, amazing.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So I'm thinking, the generation before you, these guys would all learn, as teenagers at jam sessions. They would get together, and I'm talking about, people from the 40s and 50s that are coming up. They would get together and jam. Then later generations, people kind of mainly went to college and learned in these, jazz programs.
Right.
You didn't do either of those. You kind of came out of it.
Well, I did a fair amount of jamming. I mean,
Well, I guess not so much.
I mean, this is the big. We're talking so far. We're talking about my first, 8 to 12 months of being into jazz, and then some agent wanted me to go and play, believe it or not, for Bob Cohen, who was he was an eminent jazz pianist, and he also. So I went and played for him. I had this medley I did. I did this at the Red Fox, and they actually liked this one. I did a medley. I always did this medley of Caravan with Ravel's Bolero because they were both based on this Phrygian pedal point. In retrospect, it might be a little corny, but it seemed fun at the time. But but I did that, and then he said, who you should really get with is this guy who lives near here, Bernard Peiffer. And I'd heard Bernard's name and even heard one recording because a friend of mine whose father loved jazz played it for me one time. And I really liked it. And so I went to his house in Chestnut Hill, took at my very first lesson. Now keep in mind, I'm very green with jazz. Hadn't absorbed even that much straight ahead stuff. And he starts ticking off on his fingers. You do not use enough bitonality. You must take things into a different dimension. And it was all this very high-minded stuff that was totally cool. Now, he didn't teach normally either. I've talked to other students that he had. Apparently, he did teach them fairly normally.
Like scales and modes and stuff like that.
Yeah, he didn't do any of that with me. He would say, can you make that intro sound more introductory? He would say, can you keep in mind the climax that you're aiming for? It was very aesthetic stuff. It was more like the how rather than the what. And, and he was very articulate with it too, and he could relate it. And he often assigns me, even if sometimes to learn, but a lot of times not to learn, just to check out. He would say, check out this Hindemith piece, check out this Prokofiev piece. And to this day, Prokofiev is one of my main harmonic influences for my jazz writing. Something about it, the dark,
Slavic.
Yeah, but harmonically it has all this really interesting stuff it's sort of half in, half out in a way you almost can't define. I downloaded somebody's 200-page paper on it recently that I've read 3 pages of. But
Let me ask you this. So to get down a little bit nuts and bolts, where did you take lessons from Bernard?
at his house on Ardley Street in Chestnut Hill.
And how much did they cost?
At the time, he apologized for having to charge me $20 a lesson.
Is that for an hour? Or?
Yeah, and I met numerous people there. That guy was telling you about, Jim Brent, and Sumi Tanuka. She would often come in after me.
Uri came?
Well, he studied with him much younger than I was. Uri studied with him when he was 13. Uri got into jazz much younger. And
I'm thinking, that in the previous, I keep spanning the generations. About Dennis Sandoli was like this, incredible influence on Coltrane and this whole school.
Right.
And I think this Bernard Peiffer was kind of had a similar role maybe 20 years later for a whole school of Philly jazz pianists, no?
Well, the thing is, it was less of a guru thing. Like with all due respect, people were always trying to get me to go to Dennis. I knew temperamentally it would not fit with me because it was so much, I don't know, it just seemed like a guru thing, musically viable, of course. And the best people that went to them obviously used it their own way and, were not clones. But I think Bernard was even more open. Like, there was one phase where every time I played a concert, I would do all the tunes that he and Al did and try to do them like him. And somebody told him about that. And the next lesson he'd say, "We look for you. You do not want to be me." So
it's interesting. Jazz musicians of your age, it's the same kind of trajectory that Jim Miller had when in fact, he might even listen to the same Coltrane thing at the same year when that blew his mind too. But they have different experiences than the ones from the 50s and the 60s where they're going into people's houses and jamming necessarily.
well, we did that too.
Yeah, but it was more like with the rock stuff, right?
Oh, no, not after. No, as soon as I got out of high school, as soon as I heard Coltrane, there's only a handful of times I've listened to rock since then, since 1973. I don't even know the names of most of the groups since then. Once in a while, if I have to learn something for a gig or if I hear Brad Meldau cover something, I become aware of some group. But
now, what was your first jazz gig?
Well, I would say this Red Fox Inn gig. Even though it was solo, my entire solo concept was based on listening to groups. So I always played bass lines. I didn't like a lot of players do a whole different thing. Solo piano, they make everything rubato. I might do that once in a while to open something up, but most of the time I would play in time, and my favorite thing in the world is being the bass player. Even though I'm not into organ, which sounds funny. I like the bass lines on organ. I'm not as enamored with the upper register.
Did you ever sit in with any of the jam sessions in town?
Trying to think back then.
Like Bootsy Ball with Bootsy or?
Ortlieb's didn't even exist then, as far as I know. So that was my first gig. Then slowly, as I started one or two people at a time branching into the Philly network, there was a place called Carol's Lombard. You remember that? It was at something in Lombard, in the 20s maybe.
Yeah.
It might be called Tangier now or something like that. They had jazz. Yeah, I played in a group. We had a band with Robin Eubanks called Equinox that was led by the trumpet player Devin Leonard, who's Neil Leonard's brother, a saxophonist that is on one of the CDs in there. I think it was through them I met Bobby Zankel for the first time because he played one of their gigs. There's another place we played. There was a house gig at this place down in the pit at 19th and Chestnut called Periwinkle. And, they had jazz 6 nights a week. So Ori Kane and I split the gig and sub for each other. We hung out a lot back then. He lived 45th and Locust. Sometimes we'd stay up all night playing four hands. But so we had this gig, It was also my first real experience backing up a singer. There was a singer named Liz Jordan. She was, even at the time, she was getting up there, but I think she was good. She sounded good to me. I don't know what I knew back then. There were various bass players that did the gigs. Steve Beskrone, John Lightham, who's now Jennifer Lightham. Dean Levitt played electric bass. There was a great drummer that I played with a number of times, Hakeem Emmanuel Thompson. There's another one too, I can't remember.
Are you playing mostly straight ahead jazz?
Yes.
You're not doing fusion or anything? Because I know you were kind of into that a little bit.
Well, actually, I wasn't really into it, no. No, I became, for a while, I was a hardcore acoustical snob. Yeah, I'm much looser now because I've heard really good stuff in almost any idiom, even stuff
You're not doing like Return to Forever or Weather Report or any of that stuff. You're doing like...
No, Steve Beskrome was always into that, so he would sometimes bring in something that we'd do, and he would make fun of me for being a snob, but it was cool.